Welcome to Hammersmith Memorial Chapel here at Elmhurst University. Today is July 8th, 2021. We are gathering here 55 years after the historic date when the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke here at our chapel. In but 2 days after that event, on that Friday night when it was completely packed, the chapel was full and electrified with Dr. King's words. Dr. King spoke to the city of Chicago at Soldier Field. In 1 year after that event, he wrote the famous book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? It is that question, where do we go from here, on the 55th anniversary of Dr. King's address and the historic 150th anniversary of Elmhurst University that we are in now, that we have invited the Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas, Dean of the Episcopal Divinity School in New York City at Union Theological Seminary, to intersect those two dates, historically the 55th and the 150th of Elmhurst University. To help us with this, we have asked our president, Dr. Troy Van Aken, to bring us words of welcome. It is my hope that you shall take these two events, Dr. King's address and the 150th anniversary of Elmhurst University, and blend them together for our work together. With that, thank you all for coming, and we look forward to words now from our president. Dr. Troy Van Aken, good day.
Thank you, Scott, and good evening, everyone. As 14th president of Elmhurst University, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this important commemoration. As we reflect on the 55th anniversary of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech in Hammersmith Memorial Chapel, we are honored to have this historic opportunity to consider that event in the context of the university's sesquicentennial anniversary, which we're celebrating this year. Throughout our 150-year history, Elmhurst has transformed the lives of its students through education, preparing them to contribute meaningfully to a world that needs their diverse insights, their knowledge, and promise. At the heart of that experience is our ongoing commitment to building a community, our ever-widening circle, that reflects our values of equity, inclusion, and welcome. They helped to bring Dr. King to our community in 1966. He has since inspired public lectures and conversations, academic and co-curricular initiatives, and other work on our campus that continues to this day and has never been more vital. Our annual Martin Luther King Jr. and Intercultural Lecture is an important way for the campus to regularly explore the lasting relevance of his work. That lecture and other intercultural and religious lectures greatly enrich the intellectual life of our university. Tonight, we're honored to be joined by Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas, who will help our students and all of us to reflect on this historic moment. As we reflect on the challenges that face our nation today, the painful yet momentous events of the past year have compelled us to confront racism that still exists today. We are committed to remembering Dr. King's lessons and to working as a community to build a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive campus and world. So during this 150th anniversary year, I invite you to join us as we honor Dr. King's legacy by living up to the responsibilities that we have to each other. In this way, we will uphold the dream and will continue to make Elmhurst University a community of learning, service, and distinction. It's now my pleasure to introduce Elmhurst alumnus and university trustee, the Reverend Dr. L. Bernard Jakes, who will introduce Dr. Douglas. Thanks again for joining us tonight. And now, Dr. Jakes.
On the occasion of the 150th anniversary of Elmhurst University and the 55th anniversary of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. speaking in Hammersmith Chapel on our campus on July 8, 1966, we are pleased to present the Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas, Dean of the Episcopal Divinity School at Union Theological Seminary in New York City, as she reflects on the historical moment of the 55th anniversary of Dr. King speaking on campus, the 150th anniversary of Elmhurst University, and how communities of faith and higher education can work together. We are pleased to have Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas Hear ye her as she comes.
Let me begin by thanking Dean Matheny for this generous invitation to speak with you today, and to congratulate President Van Aken and the Elmhurst University community as you celebrate your 150th anniversary, as well as commemorate the 55th anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s address to you on this campus. It was a hot Wednesday afternoon in August. My brother, two sisters, and I were playing in our bedrooms while my parents were sitting on the living room couch watching something on TV. Out of nowhere, with a sense of urgency, my mother called the four of us to come quickly to see what they were watching. We all ran in, not quite knowing what to expect. When we got there, my parents told us to sit down and watch because history was being made. I did not know what they meant by that, but I followed their instructions. I sat and I watched the history that was being made on the television screen. I remember watching and wondering why so many people, especially Black people, were all standing in the hot sun listening to a man give a speech. My then 6-year-old mind was not taking in what he was saying. What I was taking in, however, was my parents' reactions to his words. Both were clearly moved. Occasionally, one of them would utter, "That's right." That history-making day was August 28th, 1963. When Martin Luther King Jr. seized the American imagination with his anti-racist dream for this nation and its people. What I did not realize then was that for my parents, the history being made in that moment in time was also about their hope that the dream they had for their 4 children was coming closer to reality on that day. They too wanted their 4 children to live in an anti-racist world where they, as King said, will not be judged for the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. My parents too wanted, as King dreamed, a time when little Black boys and little Black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and little white girls as sisters and brothers. What I did not realize at that time was the sense of urgency that my parents no doubt felt as they listened to King. For they knew what I would only come to know as an adult, and that is that 8 years earlier, on that very day, another mother's dream for her child had come to a tragic end. In the 2:00 a.m. hour of August 28th, 1955, Mamie Till's 14-year-old son, Emmett Lewis Till, was dragged from a relative's home where he was staying in Mississippi and lynched because he was accused of flirting with a 22-year-old white woman. Over 60 years later, this woman admitted that she had fabricated parts of the story that led to Emmett's monstrous murder at the hands of her then husband and his half-brother, both now deceased, but both of whom, after being innocent of Till's murder by being found innocent of Till's murder by an all-white jury, later bragged in Look magazine about how they indeed did in fact lynch Emmett Till that August 28th morning and dispose of his body in the Tallahatchie River. Why am I talking about this August 28th day? Because decades after King's speech and Emmett Till's lynching, this one August day, and hence these 2 events, still capture the searing truth of this nation. In his classic 1903 text, The Souls of Black Folk, W.E.B. Du Bois, who, by the way, died on August 27th, 1963, at the age of 95, just one day before King's speech. Anyway, in his book, The Souls of Black Folk, W.E.B. Du Bois uses the metaphor of warring souls to describe what he believed then to be the existential dilemma of African Americans. This warring soul metaphor, however, aptly captures the story of our nation. For ours is a nation with a warring soul. Borrowing from the words of Du Bois, America is a nation with two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals. The warring soul of our nation is striking today when we consider that even as this nation has seen the election of a Black president and a South Asian Jamaican female vice president, the lives of people of color are still threatened every day by the white supremacist anti-Black racist realities manifest not simply by brutal biased policing and hate crimes, but in the comorbidities such as poverty with its concomitant realities of inadequate housing, unemployment, educational, and healthcare opportunities that have left Black and Latinx communities disproportionately vulnerable to the ravages of COVID-19. That we as a nation find ourselves in a warring soul predicament is not new. For the truth of the matter is that this warring reality is intrinsic to our nation's very founding identity. And so throughout this nation's history, we have been challenged by the reality of two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals. Are we going to be an Anglo-Saxon city on a hill or a beacon of God's diverse creation? Are we going to be an enslaving nation or a freedom-defying nation? Are we going to be a Jim and Jane Crow nation or a just and equitable nation? Are we going to be a xenophobic and intolerant nation or a multicultural and welcoming nation? Are we going to be a nation where systemic, structural, and cultural heteropatriarchal whiteness stands its ground by any means necessary? Or a nation where all may safely live and move and have their being? The fact of the matter is, our soul is at war with, if not being held captive, by the Anglo-Saxon white supremacist values to which the founders and framers of this nation were beholden and that have become a part of this nation's DNA, if not collective psyche. Now, before I go further, it is probably instructive to specify what I mean by the soul of our nation. The soul connects human beings to our higher aspirational selves. It animates and propels people to do better and to be better. It pushes humans toward the fullest potential of what it means to be good. It symbolizes the vital moral core of a people. It reflects the essence, if you will, of our created humanity. The soul of who we are as sacred creatures, therefore, is not defined by the unpredictable and compromising beliefs of human beings, nor is it accountable to the politics and prejudices of human history. Rather, it is inextricably bound to the transcendent arc of the universe that bends toward justice, that perfect goodness, which is the peace that is the justice of God. It is the urgings of our nation's soul that are reflected in King's dream, and in fact, in the vision of a democracy espoused by the framers of this nation, affirming the inalienable rights of all persons to pursue life, liberty, and happiness. Elmhurst community, as you celebrate the converging anniversaries of Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech here 55 years ago and the founding of your university 150 years ago, there is much at stake in our nation as there ever has been before. It is not about being a Republican or a Democrat, nor is it about conservative or progressive ideologies. Inasmuch as it is about King's dream, it is about the soul of our nation. The very soul of our nation is at stake. For it seems that our nation is without the moral leadership that would help it to live into the better angels of who we are as a nation and have aspired to be. And so it is that I believe it is left to institutions of higher learning, as it is to faith communities, to provide and nurture the kind of moral leadership that will help us to live into the better angels of who we can be as a people, as a nation, as a society. So let me take the remaining time to briefly suggest what nurturing moral leadership might look like at a place like Elmhurst University. This work begins with being a community, I believe, that fosters moral dialogue. Moral dialogue is informed by two givens. First, that each and every human being, without exception, is a cherished and indispensable part of the human family. And therefore, each and every person, without exception, is sacred and has sacred worth. Period. Second, moral dialogue means that Elmhurst must be a community that is committed to engaging in the telling of the truth of who we are as a nation and as a people. This means recognizing the way in which the history and story we tell has been refracted through a dominant cultural lens meant to sustain the unequal and unjust status quo of this nation and not meant to put us on the arc that bends toward a more just future. So borrowing from the words of legal scholar Richard Rothstein, if young people are not taught an accurate account of how we come to be who we are as a nation, their generation will have little chance of doing a better job of forming a just and equal nation and society than the previous generation. And so it is. If indeed we are to foster moral dialogue, we must tell the hard and complex truth of how we got to be a nation with a warring soul. Related to this, then, is moral proximity. Being proximate, to borrow from the words of Brian Stevenson in his book, Just Mercy, we are called to be proximate with those persons who are on the very underside of justice. Inasmuch as justice means a restoration of the sacred dignity of all people, and it does, then it must begin with those whose dignity and humanity has been most assaulted. Let us make no mistake about it. It is only when the least of these are free to live into the fullness of their created humanity that justice will be realized. In short, justice always begins from the bottom up. Moral proximity involves, therefore, engaging history from the vantage point of those who are on the underside of white supremacy, the enslaved, the lynched, those who Jim Crow sought to terrorize and destroy. It is this kind of historical proximity with those who have been marginalized, subjugated, and oppressed that it can, in fact, help us to uncover the complexities of injustice that have prevented this nation from living into the urgings of its soul. In general, moral proximity means listening to, learning from, interacting with, and standing with those on the underside of justice in this nation, so to do the work that is needed to bring about a society that they will recognize as just. Otherwise, it is too easy to confuse the privileges that come from injustice with justice itself. And this leads then to the final aspect of what it means to begin to foster and nurture moral leadership, and that is moral participation, which means actually not simply protesting against systems of injustice, though protest we must, but it also means being a witness for what a just society looks like. this very Elmhurst community in its demographics, its values and cultures of relationships, learning and truth telling should reflect, as Gandhi once said, the very change we want to see. In the final analysis, moral participation means that as an institution of higher learning, Elmhurst must, in the words of Che Guevara, tremble with indignation anytime injustice is present, and it must also therefore work to create a campus and society where the sacred breath of every individual is valued. And so, there you have it. Let me now end where I began. Elmhurst College, or university, if nothing else has become clear during this time in our nation, in which two pandemics have converged, that of COVID-19 and white supremacy, one thing for sure has been clarified, and that is that we have yet to decide if we are going to be a nation and a people defined by Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream, or a nation and a people defined by Emmett Till's lynching. Our warring soul needs to be settled. And this is what I know to be true. If we are to dream of a time when all people will be respected as the sacred human beings that they are, regardless of color, ethnicity, gendered reality, or sexual expression, then institutions of higher learning like Elmhurst University must be committed in all that it does in fostering moral leadership. And that begins with moral truth-telling, moral proximity, and moral participation. As I stand here, some 50 years or so after Martin Luther King delivered his speech at the Lincoln Memorial, and when he gave that vision that came from the urging of his soul of a time where in this nation, where all would be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I, like my parents, have that same dream for my son and his children and their children. And so it is that we are called as a nation, as a people, as a university community to do the work that our souls must have in leading this nation back to its very soul. Thank you, Elmhurst.
Thank you, Dean Douglas, for your commanding words, inspiration, and challenge to our community. When we dedicated a plaque to remember Dr. King's address here, we used these words on the back of the chapel plaque. And when you come to the campus, we invite you to come to this chapel and see that moment where we pinned these words of Dr. King on a plaque. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. It is that stone of hope and the work that we are called in this 150th anniversary of Elmhurst University, on the 55th anniversary day when Dr. King spoke here. We invite you to take all that has been in this time, to wrestle with it, and to think and to pray. For that and for the stone of hope that we all work to, let us join together in prayer, beloved. Let us pray. Receive us, Almighty One, into this night, historically on the 55th anniversary of Dr. King's address at Elmhurst, and our own 150th anniversary as a university. Receive what we do and call us by the challenge of Dr. King's words, the witness of his life, and the grace and hope that we find now in the work of reconciliation, in the questions of race and racism, and the educational process. For all of this, we give you thanks. Take us into the night with hope, with justice, with joy. This we pray in your holy name. Amen. Go in peace. to love and serve. Thanks be to God.